She traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never touched, never argued with, never truly known. And he looked her dead in the eye on that train platform and said, "I don't want you." Not in private, not with any mercy. In front of an entire town. Evelyn Hart stood there with a worn suitcase, a second-hand dress, and absolutely nowhere to go, while strangers laughed, whispered, and turned away. But the man who destroyed her in public never imagined what would rise from the wreckage. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, and stay with me until the very end. This one is worth it. The train from Caldwell arrived 12 minutes late into Red Creek, which was 12 minutes longer than Evelyn Hart had to compose herself before her entire life changed direction permanently. She sat in the last car, the cheapest seats, pressed against a window fogged with cold. Outside, the frontier town appeared slowly through the gray morning, a main street of uneven planks, a few storefronts with painted signs, a water tower leaning slightly to the left, as though it had been arguing with the wind for years and was starting to lose. Cattle pens sat at the western edge of town, a church with no steeple, a sheriff's office with a cracked front window patched with brown paper. Red Creek was not what she had imagined, but then very little about the last 3 years of her life had turned out the way she imagined. Evelyn pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and stared. She was 25 years old, which in 1883 meant she had already been called an old maid twice to her face and several more times behind her back. She knew because people in small towns have never been particularly careful about where their voices carry. She had grown up in one, Denton Falls, Ohio, and she understood the particular cruelty of community, the way neighbors smile at your face and dissect your choices the moment the door closes behind you. She had left Denton Falls with very little: a suitcase containing 2 dresses, a winter coat with a fraying hem, 3 books, a photograph of her mother taken the year before she died, and $43 folded inside a handkerchief at the bottom of her skirt pocket. She had sold her mother's rocking chair to get the train ticket. She told herself she would buy another one someday. She didn't entirely believe it. The advertisement had found her through her cousin Margaret, who had found it in the back pages of a regional gazette that circulated through 3 counties. Widowed landowner, Red Creek, Wyoming Territory, seeks woman of good character and working disposition for purpose of marriage and household management. 2 children. Respond in writing to Box 44. It was not a romantic advertisement. It wasn't trying to be. That was, oddly, what made Evelyn trust it. She had written back. A careful letter, honest about who she was. No family left, modest education, experienced with farm work, cooking, and the general maintenance of a life built from necessity rather than comfort. She was not glamorous and did not claim to be. She wrote, "I know how to keep a house through hard winters and harder years, and I do not frighten easily." The reply came 3 weeks later. His name was listed as Mr. D. Carlyle. He confirmed the arrangement in brief, practical sentences. He mentioned the children were young. He mentioned the winters were brutal. He gave her an arrival date and the name of the platform in Red Creek. He did not describe himself further, and she did not ask him to. There was a kind of dignity in the simplicity of it, she thought. 2 practical people solving a practical problem. She had folded that letter and believed in it. That was her first mistake. The train slowed with a long groan of metal, steam hissing up past the windows in white clouds. Evelyn gathered her coat around her shoulders. It was April, but the Wyoming wind had not received the news about spring, and lifted her suitcase from the rack above her seat. The suitcase was heavier than it looked. She had repacked it 4 times before leaving Denton Falls, trying to reduce the weight, and each time put everything back in because she could not decide what mattered less. She carried everything she owned down the aisle. A man near the front of the car, broad and well-fed, glanced at her suitcase and then at her face and said nothing, which was still somehow worse than if he had spoken. Evelyn stepped off the train onto the platform. There were perhaps 40 people gathered. Not all of them were there for her arrival. This was simply the train coming in, the weekly event, the one disruption to routine that Red Creek permitted itself. But a significant cluster of them had clearly come to observe. Word had spread that Douglas Carlyle was collecting his mail-order bride today. In a town of fewer than 300 people, that was sufficient entertainment to pull a crowd on a cold Thursday morning. She saw him immediately. She knew it was him not because she recognized him. She had no photograph, no description beyond widowed landowner, but because he was the only man on the platform who was looking at her the way people look at a purchase they've reconsidered. Douglas Carlyle was somewhere north of 40, thick through the chest, with a dark beard trimmed close, and eyes that were not unkind in the abstract, but were, in this particular moment, filled with something that looked distressingly like regret. He wore a good coat. His boots were clean. He was exactly the kind of man who would have written those careful, practical letters. He was also already shaking his head before she had taken 3 steps toward him. Evelyn stopped walking. The crowd had gone quiet. Not completely. There were still the sounds of the train settling, a child crying somewhere behind the depot, a dog barking from across the street. But the specific conversation hum of 40 gathered humans dropped away to near nothing, the way it does when people understand something significant is about to happen and don't want to miss it. "Miss Hart," his voice carried. He didn't appear to intend it that way, but the cold air and the silence made it carry anyway. "Mr. Carlyle," she said. Her own voice was steadier than she expected. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that is an assessment, the kind that measures and finds the measurement insufficient. "I received a letter," he said, "last week, from a woman in Cheyenne, a woman I had correspondence with some months before your own response arrived." He paused, cleared his throat. "She's agreed to come instead. Her arrival is next month." Evelyn said nothing. She was still holding her suitcase. "I wrote to notify you," he continued, and there was something almost like genuine discomfort in the words. "But I expect the letter crossed paths with your journey." "It did," she said. "I didn't receive any letter." "No." He looked down briefly. "I suspect not." The crowd was very quiet now. Evelyn was aware of them the way you are aware of a fire, not looking directly at it, but feeling the heat of it on the side of your face. She was aware that this was a spectacle, that she was the spectacle, that every face turned toward her was collecting details to report later at kitchen tables and over fences. She was aware that she was 25 years old, 2,000 miles from the only place she had ever called home, with $43 and a suitcase in her hand, and that the plan she had staked the remainder of her 20s on had just collapsed publicly in front of 40 strangers. She was also aware that her face was doing something she needed to control immediately, because she was not going to cry on this platform. She was absolutely not going to do that. "I see," she said. "There's a women's boarding house on Clement Street," Carlyle offered, with the carefully managed tone of a man performing minimal responsibility. "Mrs. Tate runs it. She's decent. You could stay there while you arrange your return passage." Return passage, as though she had somewhere to return to. Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the crowd. She looked at the town behind them, the crooked water tower, the patched window on the sheriff's office, the mud-churned main street, and she understood with perfect clarity that Douglas Carlyle had not just rejected her. He had done it here, in this place, in front of these people, and he had done it without a moment's hesitation because he had decided, somewhere in the mathematics of his decision-making, that her embarrassment was an acceptable cost. "Thank you, Mr. Carlyle," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I hope she makes you very happy." The words came out without irony and without venom, which was perhaps why they landed the way they did. She watched something flicker across his face that might have been shame, gone too quickly to confirm. She turned away from him. She did not look at the crowd. She stared straight ahead at the far end of the platform and made herself take one step, then another, because the only other option was to stand still, and that was not something she was willing to do. A woman near the edge of the crowd said something to the woman beside her in a voice that was almost a whisper. Evelyn caught 3 words, "Poor pathetic thing." She kept walking. Then from somewhere to her left, a man's voice cut across the murmur. "Does she have somewhere to be?" It was not a loud voice. It was not a dramatic voice. It was the voice of someone asking a practical question, and it sliced through the crowd noise with the particular authority of someone accustomed to being listened to when they spoke. Not because they commanded it, but because they didn't waste words. Evelyn stopped. She turned. The man was standing slightly apart from the main cluster of people, near the edge of the platform where it met the steps down to the street. He was perhaps 35, lean but solid in the way that comes from actual labor rather than affectation, wearing a coat that had seen several winters and a hat that had seen a few more. He had dark hair going a little gray at the temples, and a face that was not handsome in any conventional frontier town poster way, but was honest, if honesty can be a quality of a face. The kind of face that hasn't practiced expressions in a mirror. He was looking at Douglas Carlyle. "Does she?" he repeated. Carlyle blinked. "That's not—" "I'm asking a direct question," the man said. Not aggressive, just very clear about the question. "She can go to Mrs. Tate's," Carlyle said, with a slight edge now. "I mentioned it." "Mrs. Tate's been full since February," the man said. He said it like information, not argument. "I fixed her water pipe 2 weeks ago. She's got no spare rooms." A beat of silence. The man turned his eyes to Evelyn then. They were gray-green, she noticed. Difficult to read, not because they were cold, but because they were careful. "My name is Gideon Brooks," he said. "I'm a carpenter. I've got a cabin at the north edge of town. It's got a spare room." He paused, and she understood he was choosing his next words with some precision. "It's not an offer of anything other than a room. I've got 2 children and no time for anything other than work. But you'd have a place to stay until you figure out what comes next." The crowd had gone completely silent. Evelyn looked at him. She was good at reading people. Living alone teaches you to read people quickly because you can't afford to be wrong. And what she read in Gideon Brooks's face was not pity, exactly. It was something more useful than pity. It was a person who had seen something unfair happen and had decided, with no apparent drama about it, to do something rather than watch. "Why?" she asked. He considered the question as though it was reasonable, which it was. "My wife died 2 years ago," he said. "When she was sick, most people watched. A few people helped." He looked at her steadily. "I remember the difference." The entire platform waited. Evelyn became aware, distantly, that she was clenching the handle of her suitcase so tightly her fingers had gone cold. She released her grip slightly. The cold air pressed against her face, and the crowd pressed against her edges, and everything she had counted on had dissolved into the mud of this platform, and she had $43 and nowhere to go. She looked at Gideon Brooks. "All right," she said. She walked toward him. He fell into step beside her without ceremony, without any apparent awareness that the entire town of Red Creek was watching them descend the platform steps together. Or perhaps he was aware and simply didn't find it relevant. Behind them, she heard Douglas Carlyle begin to say something, then stop. She did not turn around. The cabin was a 30-minute walk from the platform, north along a track that left the main street and wound through scrub and pine before opening into a small clearing. The wind was worse out here, coming down off the higher ground to the west, carrying a cold that felt institutional, like it had been arranged specifically and had intentions. Gideon walked slightly ahead of her on the narrow track, not because he was ignoring her, but because the path required it. He had offered to carry her suitcase at the edge of town, and she had said no, automatically, before she could assess whether the refusal was pride or habit. He had nodded and said nothing more about it. They had walked for 10 minutes in silence before he spoke. "The room is small," he said. "It was a storage room originally. I cleared it out last winter when I thought about taking in a boarder, then didn't get around to finding one." "It's fine," she said. "It has a window. The latch sticks in cold weather. I'll fix it." "You don't have to." "It's not much trouble." Another stretch of silence. The pines on either side of the track had gotten taller and closer. The sky above them was the flat white of clouds that hadn't decided yet whether they were going to do something. "Your children," Evelyn said. "How old?" "Ethan is 11. Lucy is 7. He paused. "Ethan is—" He stopped again, seeming to edit something. "He's had a difficult couple of years. He's a good boy. He's also not going to make this easy for you." Evelyn almost smiled. "Not quite. I appreciate the warning. Lucy is different. She's—" He paused again, and this time the pause had a different quality, softer. "She asks a lot of questions. About everything. I never know how to answer half of them." "What kind of questions?" "Last week she asked me why the moon stays up." He said it without any particular tone, but there was something in it. The specific texture of a parent who has been surprised by his own child and hasn't entirely recovered. "What did you tell her?" "That I'd ask someone who knew." He glanced sideways at her briefly. "I don't have a good answer for that one." "I do," Evelyn said. "If she asks." He nodded, and they walked. The cabin was larger than the word cabin had suggested to her, which had conjured something barely sufficient, some single room with a fire pit and a floor that was mostly ambitious dirt. Gideon's cabin was 2 stories, built with the careful economy of someone who understands structure. The joints tight, the logs laid true, a porch that was not decorative but was clearly used. Tools hung in precise order along one wall, a woodpile stacked with geometric seriousness. It was also, undeniably, a house that had been run by grief for 2 years. Not dirty, not chaotic, but drained. Like a plant that has been watered correctly but never placed in adequate light. The curtains were still there but a little gray. The table was clean, but the chairs had been pushed in wrong and not corrected. Someone had started to repaint the front door and stopped halfway, and the unpainted half had been there long enough that the painted half was already showing wear. Evelyn took all of this in and said nothing about any of it. The children were inside. She heard them before she saw them. A low argument about something that went silent the moment the door opened. Lucy was at the table with a picture book open in front of her, a small girl with her father's gray-green eyes and dark hair in 2 uneven braids that someone, presumably her father, had made their best attempt at. She looked up at Evelyn with the complete, unguarded curiosity of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned that curiosity is sometimes impolite. "Are you the woman from the train?" Lucy asked. "I am," Evelyn said. "Papa said a man was rude to you." Evelyn glanced at Gideon, who appeared to find the far wall interesting. "Something like that," she said. "That's not good manners," Lucy said, with the authority of someone who has been recently instructed on the subject. "Did you cry?" "Lucy?" Gideon's voice was quiet, but had the particular weight of a father who means it. "I didn't," Evelyn said. Lucy seemed to accept this. "I cried when my mama died," she said conversationally. "Papa says it's okay to cry when things are hard." The room was very still for a moment. "Your papa is right," Evelyn said. Ethan was in the doorway to the back room. She had not seen him come in. He was 11 and tall for it, with his father's dark hair but sharper features and eyes that were doing precisely what 11-year-old eyes do when they have appointed themselves guardian of something important, measuring her, finding her suspicious, pre-deciding that whatever she was going to do would probably be wrong. "Why is she here?" he said. Not to Evelyn, to his father. "She needed somewhere to stay," Gideon said. "We're not a boarding house." "Ethan." "I'm just saying, but—" "I know what you're saying." Gideon set his hat on the hook by the door with the deliberateness of a man closing a topic. "She'll have the storage room. She'll be staying until she has a plan. That's the situation." Ethan looked at Evelyn. The look was not friendly and did not attempt to be. Evelyn met his eyes directly and did not try to smile in any way that would have been dishonest about the situation. She just looked at him and waited and then said, "I'm not here to rearrange anything. I'll stay out of your way as much as I can." Ethan said nothing, but he kept looking at her, which was, she suspected, the closest thing to a truce she was going to get tonight. The storage room was small. Gideon had not exaggerated. A narrow bed frame with a rope mattress, a wooden crate serving as a table, a hook on the wall, a window with a latch that required a specific combination of lift and twist that he demonstrated twice before she got it. The cold came through the north wall in a steady conversation. "I can add insulation in the spring," he said. "I may not be here in the spring," she said. A pause. "Right," he said. "Well, if you are." He left her to it. She heard him in the main room for a while, the small sounds of a house settling into its evening routine. The fire built up, Lucy's voice asking something, Ethan's deliberate silence pans on the stove. She sat on the edge of the rope bed and opened her suitcase and looked at everything inside it. $43.35 now. She had spent change on the platform vendor for water, 2 dresses, a winter coat, 3 books, her mother's photograph. She took the photograph out and propped it against the wooden crate. Her mother looked back at her from 1871, 12 years ago, from a woman who had also spent her whole life rebuilding from whatever had just fallen, who had also made peace with situations that weren't what she'd planned. "Well," Evelyn said to the photograph. She was not sure what else to say. The latch on the window stuck in the cold. She fixed it with the specific combination, lift, twist, and the night air breathed through the gap she'd opened, sharp with pine and coming weather. Tak. She was up before dawn. Not because she couldn't sleep, though that was partly true, because there were things that needed doing, and doing things was, for Evelyn Hart, the primary method by which she avoided drowning in her own thoughts. The kitchen was cold. The fire in the main room had burned to coals. She built it up carefully without making more noise than necessary, then went to the kitchen stove and started the process of figuring out what they had and what could be made from it. The pantry was sufficient, but barely. Flour, lard, some dried beans, a small supply of cornmeal, smoked pork of uncertain vintage, some root vegetables going soft in a crate on the floor. Enough. Not comfortable, but enough. She made biscuits. She started a pot of beans. She found coffee and made that too because the morning was the kind that required it. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway at first light and stopped when he saw her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." He looked at the biscuits and then at the coffee and then at her. "I was going to make porridge," he said. "I know. I thought something different might be good." He pulled out a chair and sat down. He was still in his work clothes from yesterday, she noticed, or had changed into identical ones. He poured himself coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug, the way people do when they are very cold or very tired, and he was possibly both. "How long have you been up?" he asked. "A while. You don't sleep?" "Not always." She set a plate of biscuits on the table. "It's not a complaint. I've always been this way." He took a biscuit and ate it and was quiet for a moment. Then, "These are good. They're just biscuits. Mine aren't. Do you want me to show you?" He looked up at her. Something in his face that might have been surprise, or might have been something he was deciding whether to let be surprise. "Maybe," he said. Lucy appeared in the kitchen doorway 11 minutes later, hair loose from the previous evening's braids, still carrying the picture book from the night before as though she'd slept with it. "It smells different," she announced. "Good different or bad different?" Evelyn asked. Lucy sniffed seriously. "Good." She sat down at the table with the ceremony of someone settling in for an important meal. "Can I have one?" "That's what they're for." Lucy ate 2 biscuits and drank half a cup of milk and asked 4 questions, of which one was about the moon, and Evelyn answered them all. Gideon watched this with an expression that was carefully neutral and not entirely successful at it. Ethan appeared last, at the door, already dressed, already decided. He looked at the breakfast on the table and then at Evelyn at the stove, and then sat down without speaking and ate with the concentrated efficiency of someone who has chosen to receive the benefits of a situation while registering formal protest about the situation. It was fine. She hadn't expected more than that. After breakfast, Gideon went to his workshop, an attached structure on the east side of the cabin that she could hear from the kitchen, the measured sounds of someone who works with precision. She washed the dishes. Lucy stayed in the kitchen, supposedly reading, actually watching Evelyn with transparent fascination. "Do you know how to sew?" Lucy asked. "Yes. My dress has a hole in the elbow." "I saw. I can fix it if you bring it to me." Lucy immediately disappeared and returned in 3 minutes with the dress. Evelyn found a needle and thread in the sewing box on the shelf. The thread was knotted and the needles were in no particular order, but they were there, and sat at the table and began to work. "Mama used to do that," Lucy said. Evelyn kept her eyes on her work. "Do you miss her?" "Yes." A pause. "Do you miss anybody?" "My mother. She died when I was 22. "Were you sad?" "For a long time." "Papa was sad for a long time," Lucy said. "He's better now, but sometimes I can still see it." She seemed to consider this. "You probably saw it." Evelyn looked up from the sewing. "A little," she admitted. "He's good at hiding it," Lucy said, with the expert tone of someone who has been observing closely. "But not as good as he thinks." Evelyn returned to her work. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like breathing, and the fire in the main room clicked and settled, and Gideon's workshop produced its steady, careful percussion, and the dress in her hands was a simple fix, a small thing, one small right thing in a day that still had many hours left to be uncertain in. A week passed, then another. The town of Red Creek did not forget. Small towns never forget. They simply cycle the forgetting through enough retelling that it becomes part of the furniture, present in every room without anyone consciously deciding to keep it. She was the woman Carlyle left on the platform. She was the one staying with Gideon Brooks, if you can believe it. She was a subject of very specific community attention, the kind that dresses itself as concern but is primarily entertainment. When she went to the general store for the first time, 3 days after her arrival, the man behind the counter, Mr. Abner Foss, she would learn, 50 years old, a widower himself, with the particular self-appointed authority of someone who runs the only general store in town, looked at her over the counter with an expression that wanted to be kind but was working too hard at it to get there. "Miss Hart," he said, "I heard about your situation." "I expect you did," she said. "Are you finding everything you need out at the Brooks place?" She had a list in her hand. Gideon had given her money from a small jar on the kitchen shelf, not much, just what was needed, and told her what they were short on without appearing to register that he was trusting her with money 2 weeks into knowing her, which suggested either poor judgment or good instinct, and she was reserving opinion on which. "I'm managing," she said. "I need flour, baking powder, and if you have dried apples, those would be useful." Foss got the things without further commentary, but she was aware of the other 2 women in the store listening with total alertness while appearing to examine bolts of fabric. When she turned to leave, one of them, a woman around 40 with a composed, self-satisfied face that Evelyn recognized from every town she had ever been in, the specific face of someone who has decided community standards are their personal responsibility, spoke up. "Staying much longer, then?" the woman said. She said it pleasantly. That was the thing about this particular kind of question. It always came wrapped in pleasantness, which makes it difficult to respond to without appearing unreasonable. Evelyn turned. "I'm not sure yet," she said. "Only it's a bit irregular," the woman said. "A single woman staying with a widower. People do talk." "I've noticed," Evelyn said. "It reflects on him, you understand. He's a good man. We wouldn't want—" "I understand your concern," Evelyn said, keeping her voice even. "It's a practical arrangement and a temporary one. I'm grateful for it, and I expect Mr. Brooks is capable of managing his own reputation without assistance." She paid for her purchases and left. Her hands were shaking slightly by the time she reached the street. Not from anger, exactly. From the effort of maintaining control in the face of something that wanted to knock her down again. Because the thing about being publicly humiliated once is that it lowers the threshold. Smaller things start to feel like attacks, and you have to keep reminding yourself what is actually a threat and what is just noise. She stood in the cold street with her parcel under one arm and looked at Red Creek in the flat morning light. She was here. She had arrived. The plan had failed, and she was still here. So she started walking back to the cabin. The porch steps had a problem. The third one from the bottom had been bouncing slightly for days, a soft give underfoot that telegraphed eventual failure. She had noticed it on her second day. She had not said anything about it because it was his house and not her business. On the 11th day, she fixed it. It was not a complicated repair. The issue was a single nail that had worked loose and a board that needed reseating and a second nail to correct the angle. She found the tools in the workshop in an organized rack along the south wall, and she found nails in a correctly labeled jar, because Gideon Brooks's workshop was the most ordered space in the cabin, possibly the most ordered space in Red Creek, and she was careful to take only what she needed and return everything to its place. She had the step fixed in 20 minutes. Gideon came out of the workshop in the afternoon to find her sweeping the porch and stopped at the top of the steps. He tested the third step. He tested it again. "You fixed it," he said. "It was going to break." "I know." He looked at the step, then at her. "I meant to get to it." "There's always something else," she said. He stood there for a moment, then he said, "Did you work on buildings before?" "My father was a carpenter," she said. "Like you." Something shifted in his face. Small. She might have imagined it. "He taught you?" "He didn't mean to. I just watched." She paused. "I was better at it than he thought." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something on its way there. "There's a window in the back room," he said. "The frame is swollen from moisture. I've been fighting it all winter." "Show me," she said. He showed her. They worked on it together for an hour, the two of them in the narrow back room with the tools between them, and he discovered she had not been overstating the watching. She had learned well. "Your father was good," he said, at one point, examining a join she had made. "He was," she said. He died when I was 16. He didn't say I'm sorry in the automatic reflexive way that people use to fill the space around someone else's loss. He just nodded, acknowledging the fact of it, and handed her the next piece, and they kept working. In the evenings, after supper, Gideon sat at the table with the account books for his work, the orders placed and fulfilled, the materials costs, the amounts owed, and the amounts received. She could see from across the room that the numbers were tight, not desperate, but close to the edge that requires care. He never spoke about it, but she could see him adding the same column 3 times, frowning at the total each time as though the third would give him a different answer. Lucy had attached herself to Evelyn with the systematic devotion of a child who has identified something she needs and decided to proceed without asking permission first. She appeared at Evelyn's elbow during cooking, during mending, during the reading hour that Evelyn had established in the afternoon. Just appeared, matter-of-factly, as though the proximity was already established and she was merely continuing it. Ethan held out longer. He was not cruel. He was careful about that, in fact. She suspected that whatever else was happening in his 11-year-old mind, he had been raised with specific standards about how to treat people, and his mother had apparently made those standards clear. He didn't say cutting things to her. He didn't misbehave in obvious ways. He simply refused her, consistently, methodically, with the patience of someone who has decided to outlast a situation. He answered her direct questions with one word when possible. He accepted the food she cooked without comment. He watched her from across rooms with those measuring eyes. On the 16th evening, she was at the table after supper with one of her books when she heard him struggling with something in the back room. A scraping sound, repeated, then silence, then repeated again. She went to look. He was trying to move a heavy wooden chest toward the window, alone. His face had the particular red of someone who is working very hard and is irritated that it's not working. She came to stand beside him and put her hands on one end of the chest. "I don't need help," he said. "I know," she said, "but it'll go faster." He looked at her hands on the chest. He looked at her face. He clearly calculated whether to maintain his position at the cost of his goal or modify his position to achieve his goal. "Fine," he said. They moved the chest on the count of 3. It went easily with 2 people. He stepped back. She stepped back. The chest sat under the window where he apparently wanted it. "Thank you," he said. The words came out like he was paying a debt he hadn't wanted to incur. "Sure," she said. She went back to her book. He was watching her from the doorway when she settled back at the table, but she didn't look up, and after a while he went to his own room, and that was that. Small things. Small things adding up in the accounting of daily life. On the 22nd day, Gideon came back from town with a letter in his hand, and the expression of a man who has received information he has not yet decided what to do with. He put it on the table after supper, without comment. She saw her name on the envelope, a return address in Cheyenne that she did not recognize. She opened it. It was from a woman she'd never met, a Mrs. Patterson, writing to say that she ran a hotel kitchen in Cheyenne and was looking for a capable woman to manage it. She had heard about Evelyn through a letter that Mrs. Patterson's nephew in Red Creek. She recognized the name. Young Thomas Becker, who had been at the platform that morning, had sent describing a very capable and dignified young woman who found herself in unfortunate circumstances. There was a wage listed. It was modest, but sufficient. There was a start date of 3 weeks out. There was an offer of a room above the kitchen. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table, face down. The cabin was quiet. Lucy was already in bed. Ethan was doing something in his room. Gideon was at the counter with his back to her, making coffee. "It's a job offer," she said. "In Cheyenne." He didn't turn around immediately. The coffee-making continued for another moment. "Is it good?" he asked. "It's workable." "You'd take it?" She looked at the letter, face down on the table. "I don't know yet," she said. He brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from her. The fire in the main room spoke to itself in the particular low language of coals. Outside, the pines were doing what they always did, receiving the wind, debating with it, surviving it. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said. "No," she agreed. They drank their coffee without deciding anything, and the evening went on around them the way evenings do, indifferent to the specific weight of the choices sitting on the table. The letter stayed on the table for 4 days. Gideon didn't ask about it again. She could tell it required effort not to. She could also tell, and this was the thing she had not expected, the development she had not planned for, that the effort was not merely practical, not merely the effort of a man who will have to manage his household differently if his temporary boarder leaves. On the fourth morning, Lucy climbed into the chair beside her at breakfast and said, without preamble, "Are you going to Cheyenne?" "I don't know, Evelyn said. "I don't want you to go," Lucy said. "I decided." "Lucy, I know you can do what you want," Lucy said, with the specific tone of a 7-year-old who has been told this recently as part of an explanation of something inconvenient. "I'm just saying what I want." Evelyn looked at her. The uneven braids, which she had been doing correctly now for 2 weeks, the gray-green eyes, the complete unguarded certainty with which this child offered what she felt. "I know," Evelyn said. "Thank you for telling me." From across the table, behind his bowl, Ethan looked up from his breakfast for a long moment. He didn't say anything. He went back to eating. But he had looked up, and she had seen his face in that moment, and whatever was in it was something she needed to sit with carefully before she made any decisions at all. The letter from Cheyenne sat on the table, face down, for 3 more days. Then she turned it over, read it one final time, and folded it back into its envelope. She had not decided yet, but she was beginning to understand the weight of what she would be deciding between, and that, she had learned, was the beginning of knowing what you actually want, as opposed to what you thought you needed when you arrived. The pines moved in the wind outside. The cabin was warm. The letter from Cheyenne stayed in her coat pocket after that. Not on the table anymore, not face down like an unanswered question in the middle of the room, but folded small and carried with her the way you carry a decision you haven't made yet, close enough to feel, not close enough to act on. She hadn't told Gideon what she'd decided, partly because she hadn't fully decided, partly because saying it out loud would make it real in a direction she wasn't sure she wanted. April turned the corner into early May without much ceremony. The snow didn't disappear so much as retreat, pulling back from the clearing around the cabin, thinning on the track into town, leaving behind mud that was spectacular in its depth and commitment. Evelyn ruined her second-best shoes on a Tuesday and spent an evening restitching the sole back on with the specific wordless irritation of someone who cannot afford to replace things. Life at the cabin had settled into a shape. Not a comfortable shape exactly, more like the shape of furniture you've rearranged to fit a room it wasn't made for. Functional, provisional. She cooked breakfast and most suppers. Gideon handled the heavy outdoor work and his carpentry orders. Lucy followed Evelyn through the days like a small, determined shadow. Ethan maintained his position, which had softened slightly from active resistance to watchful neutrality, the kind that preserves the option to retreat either direction depending on what happens next. She understood him. She had been 11 once, and she remembered how enormous and unfair the world felt at that age, and how the only control available was the control over what you let in and what you kept out. Ethan was keeping her out, but less completely than before. She counted that. The first real crack came on a Wednesday morning when Gideon was in town delivering a finished cabinet to the hardware store, and Lucy was at her lessons with the 2 other children who shared their tutor 3 times a week, an arrangement that cost Gideon money he clearly thought hard about and paid anyway, which told Evelyn something about what he valued that he wouldn't have said in words. Ethan was supposed to be splitting wood at the side of the cabin. She could hear the irregular rhythm of it from the kitchen, the good hits and the ones that glanced off, the long pauses that suggested the work was harder than he wanted to admit. She left him to it for an hour. Then the sound stopped entirely and didn't resume. She went around the side of the cabin and found him sitting on the chopping block, the axe propped against the woodpile, his right hand wrapped in his left. His face was the careful blank of someone working hard to appear fine. "Let me see," she said. "It's nothing." "Ethan." He looked up at her with the specific look of 11-year-old males everywhere, equal parts wanting help and refusing to want it. She waited. He extended his hand. The cut was across the base of his thumb, not deep enough for serious worry, but deep enough that it was bleeding steadily and would need pressure and cleaning. She had seen worse. She had also had worse from farm work when she was his age, from a scythe slip that had put a scar along her left forearm that was still there. "Come inside," she said. He came, without argument, which was its own kind of significant. She cleaned the cut at the kitchen basin, which involved water that was colder than ideal, and a cloth that he bore with compressed lips and no sound. She had some dried yarrow that she'd found in the pantry. Gideon's late wife had kept medicinal herbs, and some of them were still viable. And she made a compress with it and bound his hand with a strip of clean cloth she tore from an old shirt that was past other use. He watched her work. "You've done this before," he said. "Farm work," she said. "Plenty of practice." A pause. She tied off the binding. "Papa doesn't know how to do that," Ethan said. "The herb part." "Most people don't," she said. "Your mother probably knew." She said it carefully, as a fact, not a sentiment. She had learned that with him, sentiment was the thing that made him close, and facts were what he could receive. Something moved in his face. She knew all kinds of things like that. He looked at his wrapped hand. "She made a tea when we were sick. I don't know what was in it, but it worked. Yarrow and dried ginger, maybe. That's the common one." "Maybe." He flexed his fingers slightly and winced. "She had a book, a green book with remedies in it. I don't know where it went." Evelyn thought of the shelf in the back room, the one she hadn't fully investigated. "I'll look," she said. "You don't have to." "I know." She found the book 2 days later behind a stack of old seed catalogs on the back shelf. Green cloth cover gone soft with handling, pages annotated in a careful, slanted hand, measurements, adjustments, notes in the margins like "add more honey for Lucy." "She won't take it otherwise," and Ethan, half dose, always upset his stomach. Personal, specific. A woman's knowledge of her own family recorded in small, careful ink. She brought it to Ethan without ceremony, just set it on the table in front of him after supper. He looked at it for a moment, then he picked it up and took it to his room and didn't come back out that evening. She didn't expect him to. Some things need to be received in private. Gideon had seen the exchange from across the room. Later, after the children were in bed, he was at the table with his account books, and she was mending by the fire when he said, without looking up, "That was his mother's." "I thought it might be," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "He hasn't talked about her much, since she died." "He talks about her a little," Evelyn said. "Just not always to the people who are also grieving her. Sometimes it's easier to tell someone who doesn't have their own sadness in the way." Gideon looked up from his books. He was doing the thing again where his face was carefully neutral and not entirely getting there. "Is that experience?" he said. "Or just a guess?" "Experience," she said. "My father died when I was 16. My mother couldn't talk about him without falling apart. So I talked about him to the neighbor's dog for about a year." He stared at her. "The dog was a very good listener," she said. Something happened then that she hadn't seen yet. His face broke briefly into something unguarded. Not quite a laugh. Close to it. Something that had been very carefully maintained came loose for just a second. He looked back at his books, but the something almost a laugh had happened and couldn't be taken back, and the room felt slightly different after it. She returned to her mending and didn't say anything further because she understood instinctively that the moment was like a deer in a clearing. If you acknowledged it directly, it would disappear. The fire settled, the account books rustled. Outside, the May wind moved through the pines and for once didn't sound like argument. It sounded more like conversation. She stayed in the cabin that night, and the next, and the one after that. The letter from Cheyenne remained in her coat pocket, folded smaller now from handling. She didn't take the job in Cheyenne. She didn't announce this decision. She simply continued to be there, and the decision became a fact through continuation rather than declaration. And Gideon didn't ask, and she didn't explain, and somehow that was the right way for it to happen. What she was, technically, was a woman with $43 and a suitcase, staying in a man's house with no formal arrangement and no clear future. She was aware of this. She was also aware, with the pragmatic accuracy she had developed across 25 years of life making limited provisions, that what she had in the cabin on the north edge of Red Creek was more than she had anywhere else. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a cinematic sense, but in the real sense, the daily sense, the sense of waking up and the day having some shape to it that she had contributed to. That was not nothing. She went to town alone twice a week, for supplies and occasionally to speak with Mrs. Holt, the woman who ran the dry goods counter on the main street's eastern end, and who had, from the very beginning, treated Evelyn with a matter-of-fact decency that had nothing performative about it. Mrs. Holt was 60, a widow of 15 years, A woman who had opinions and kept most of them to herself and expressed the rest with the precision of someone who charges by the word. "You're staying, then?" Mrs. Holt said on Evelyn's 5th visit to the store. "It appears so," Evelyn said. "Foss thinks it's irregular." "Foss thinks everything west of his own property line is irregular." Mrs. Holt's mouth twitched. "The Patton women think you've designs on Gideon." "The Patton women think everyone has designs on everything," Evelyn said. "They run short of other entertainment." Mrs. Holt studied her. "Do you?" Evelyn looked up from the bolt of fabric she'd been examining. "I'm trying to get through a winter in a place where I don't know anyone, with very little money and no particular plan," she said. "I don't have energy left for designs." Mrs. Holt seemed to consider this. Then she said, "He's a good man. Difficult in the way men who've been through real grief are difficult, closed up in places, but good underneath." "I know," Evelyn said. "Do you?" "I've had some time to notice." Mrs. Holt cut the fabric and wrapped it without further comment. But as Evelyn paid and gathered her parcels, the older woman said, "He came in here 3 days after you arrived, you know. Bought thread and a packet of beeswax and a good quality bolt of wool." She looked at Evelyn. "Asked me what I thought a woman of practical habits would need to get through a Wyoming winter. Didn't say your name. Didn't have to." Evelyn stood at the counter. "He'd already decided you were staying before you had," Mrs. Holt said. She handed over the parcel. "I thought you might want to know that." Evelyn walked home in the cold with her parcels and that piece of information turning over in her mind like a stone you keep picking up to look at from a different angle. The days lengthened. She found rhythms she hadn't expected. Tuesday morning, she baked bread because Gideon's bread was honest but dense enough to use as structural material, and Lucy had begun to treat Evelyn's loaves as a significant event. Thursday afternoons, while the children were occupied, she cleared the small vegetable patch behind the cabin that had been left untended since the previous autumn, pulling the dead growth, turning the soil where it had gone hard and gray, adding ash from the fireplace in the way she had learned from watching her mother's garden survive Ohio winters. Gideon came around the cabin one afternoon and found her on her knees in the dirt, with her sleeves pushed up and her hair escaping its pins from the work. And he stopped and looked at the cleared patch, and then at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "The soil's decent under the top layer," she said, without looking up. "If we plant in 2 weeks, we'll have greens by July, beans by August." A pause. "We," he said. She looked up then. She hadn't noticed her own word choice. "If you plant," she corrected. He crouched down beside her and picked up a handful of the turned soil and rubbed it between his fingers, looking at it the way someone looks at wood grain, assessing, reading. "It is decent," he said. "I thought so." He set the soil back down. Neither of them moved for a moment. They were both looking at the cleared earth, which was safer than looking at each other, and they both seemed to understand this, and the moment stretched out in the particular way of moments that contain more than one thing and need a little time to hold all of it. "I'll get seeds from Foss tomorrow," he said. "I'll make a list of what we need." He stood. She went back to turning the soil. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the careful, unperformed expression that was his version of the significant things he never quite said all the way out loud. "Thank you," he said, and it was not about the garden. She nodded once and turned back to the soil, and he went back to the workshop, and the garden became a shared project without either of them announcing it as such, which was how most of the real things in that cabin seemed to develop, gradually, through action rather than declaration, real before either of them had properly admitted it. She taught Lucy to braid her own hair that month, which took 3 sessions and considerable patience from both of them, and produced on the 3rd attempt something that was not quite even but was entirely Lucy's own work, which made Lucy announce the achievement to Ethan with a volume and self-satisfaction that Ethan received with older sibling resignation. She helped Ethan with his figures on 2 evenings when he was struggling with a problem the tutor had assigned. She didn't do it the first time he sat at the table with the paper in front of him and the specific tight-faced expression of someone losing a fight with arithmetic. She waited until he had been at it long enough that the expression had shifted from determined to genuinely stuck. And then she said from across the room, "Do you want another pair of eyes on it?" He looked at her. The calculation again. Pride against necessity. "Maybe," he said. She came to the table and sat beside him and looked at the problem. And the issue was a simple procedural error he'd been repeating, and she showed him where without making it a lesson and without making it an occasion, just showed him and then let him work it from there. He got it on the second try. I knew it was something like that, he said, with the very specific dignity of 11-year-olds who are correct and also wrong about having known. Of course, she said, and went back to her chair. She heard him, 2 evenings later, explaining the same procedural rule to Lucy with an authority that suggested he had been practicing the explanation and was pleased with how it sounded. She did not remark on this. Some things are better left unwitnessed. The problem Evelyn had not solved and could not easily solve was the problem of money. Her $43 had become $31, mostly on small necessities: thread, a pair of work gloves, her ruined shoes, a packet of medicine when Lucy developed a week-long cough in mid-May. She had no income. She was contributing labor, but labor is not the same as income, and she was acutely aware that the difference mattered. She could not stay indefinitely on the charity of a man who was already working at the thin edge of his own margins. That was a fact she returned to regularly, turning it over the way she turned over difficult soil, looking for the angle that made it workable. She made an approach to the seamstress on Clement Street, a woman named Mrs. Dabrowski, about taking in mending work. Mrs. Dabrowski was a small, direct woman from somewhere in Eastern Europe who wore her hair in a complicated braid and had the manner of someone who has done serious work for decades and has no patience for anything that isn't. She looked at the sample mending Evelyn brought, the dress she'd fixed for Lucy, a shirt of Gideon's she'd repaired without telling him, and examined the stitching with the seriousness of a professional assessment. "Fine work," she said. "Consistent tension. You're self-taught." "My mother," Evelyn said, and then years of practice. Mrs. Dabrowski gave her 3 garments to mend as a trial, paid a fair per-piece rate, and said she'd have more if the work came back correctly. The work came back correctly. The arrangement continued. It was not much, a few dollars a week, but it was hers, earned by her hands and her skill, and the specific weight of earning rather than receiving changed something in how she moved through the days. She told Gideon about the arrangement at supper that evening. He was quiet for a moment, and she expected a version of the response men sometimes gave to women working, something that managed to contain both approval and discomfort in equal measure. What he said was, "Dabrowski's good to work for. She pays on time." "She does," Evelyn said. "You could probably get work from the hotel too," he said. "The Mercer House does their linens in-house, but they're always behind. I know because I fixed their laundry room last fall, and they complained about it for an hour." "I'll try them," she said. "I'll mention it," he said. "I've got a job there next week, shelving in the back storage." She looked at him across the table. He was cutting his food and not looking at her, in the way he had when he'd said something he meant more than he was letting on. "Thank you," she said. "It's practical," he said. "Yes," she agreed. Lucy looked between the two of them with the sharp attention of a child who doesn't understand exactly what is happening, but understands that something is and finds this interesting. Ethan was eating with the focused concentration he used when he was listening more than he wanted anyone to know. The supper continued. Outside, the May evening pressed its long light against the windows, the Wyoming sky doing what it did in this particular month, going golden and enormous and indifferent to the small particular lives it was being observed from, which was, Evelyn thought, actually a kind of comfort, once you stopped resenting the indifference and understood it as space. She had space here, not what she'd planned, not what she'd traveled 2,000 miles for, but space to be herself. Competent, useful, present, in a house that was slowly, imperfectly, with considerable friction and no drama about it, becoming something she had not had in a very long time. Not a home, exactly. Not yet. That word carried weight she wasn't ready to assign, but something on its way to one. It was on a Friday evening in the last week of May that the town made its displeasure official in the particular way that small towns do, through a designated representative. Reverend Alcott's wife, a woman named Margaret, with a permanently arranged expression of gentle concern that Evelyn had come to understand concealed a great deal of efficient judgment, arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon with a loaf of bread and a very specific agenda. Evelyn answered the door. She had flour on her hands, and her hair was loose from working over the stove. "Mrs. Brooks? Miss Hart," Margaret Alcott said, with the infinitesimal pause between the names that was not accidental. How lovely. I brought bread. She held out the loaf, which was perfectly formed and clearly intended to establish her position in the domestic hierarchy of this encounter. Is Mr. Brooks at home? He was in the workshop and she could hear the saw. He's working, Evelyn said. Oh, well. Margaret Alcott's eyes moved past Evelyn into the cabin's interior with the practiced casuality of a woman cataloging. I just wanted to stop by. Several of us in town have been thinking about you, wondering how you're getting on. Quite well, Evelyn said. Yes. The gentle concern expression tightened slightly. We do think about the children especially. They're at such a formative age, and with things being as they are, the children are well, Evelyn said. Lucy's reading is coming along nicely, and Ethan has been a real help with the wood. Margaret Alcott blinked. She had expected, perhaps, more receptiveness to the concern, more of an opening through which the actual message could be delivered. That's wonderful, she said. We just feel, some of us feel, that it would be best for everyone if the situation were more regular. Defined, for the children's sake. They've had such disruption. Evelyn held the door frame and looked at Margaret Alcott and did not say several things she was thinking. I appreciate the community's concern, she said. I really do. But I think the children's welfare is something their father and I can manage between us. The word us landed. She had not planned it. She felt Margaret Alcott receive it. Of course, Margaret said, a beat. I just mean, it's a delicate situation. People notice. People have been noticing since the day I arrived, Evelyn said. I've grown accustomed to it. Margaret Alcott departed with her bread, which she did not leave, and the concerned expression which she kept on her face all the way down the track. Gideon came out of the workshop 20 minutes later to find Evelyn in the garden with her hands in the soil, which was where she went when she needed to stop thinking about something. Mrs. Alcott stopped by, she said, without looking up. I heard, he said. He had a way of hearing things from the workshop that she had not yet mapped. She's concerned about the children. She's been concerned about my children since my wife died, he said. It doesn't make her wrong. It just makes her persistent. Evelyn sat back on her heels. The garden was coming in now, green beginning to push through the turned soil in thin, brave lines. She thinks the situation needs to be defined, she said. Gideon was quiet. She's not entirely wrong about that, Evelyn said. She said it to the garden, not to him. He came and crouched at the edge of the garden bed the way he had before, forearms on his knees. What would you want it to be? He said. His voice was very even, too even, in the way that evenness sometimes means something is being held carefully. She looked at him. He was looking at the garden. I don't know yet, she said. All right, he said. Do you? A long pause. The late May evening stretched its gold across the clearing. I'm getting there, he said. Quiet. Not a promise. An honest position. She returned to the garden. He stayed crouched at the edge of it for another minute and then stood and went back to the workshop, and the evening carried on around them with its typical indifference to unresolved things. Inside, Lucy was explaining something very detailed to Ethan, who was enduring it with older sibling patience that had, over the past month, developed a genuine undertone of affection. The fire in the main room was burning well. The bread from that morning was on the counter, half gone. The green book of remedies sat on the shelf where Ethan had returned it, next to Evelyn's 3 books, which had migrated there from her room and stayed without anyone deciding they should. The cabin was not solved. The town was not appeased. Her situation was not defined. She had $31 and a suitcase and a room with a sticky latched window. But the garden was growing. And some things, she was learning, you have to let grow at the pace they grow at, without forcing them. Her mother's voice rising from somewhere she didn't visit often. Patience isn't the same as passivity, Evelyn. Patience is when you tend something and trust it. She pressed her hands into the soil one more time, feeling the give of it, the life working underneath. Then she stood up, brushed her hands on her apron, and went back inside to start supper. June came in dry and bright, the kind of weather that makes Wyoming look like a promise kept, all wide sky and clean light and the smell of pine warming in the sun. The garden behind the cabin pushed up its green rows with the stubborn optimism of things that don't know they're supposed to be difficult. Lucy checked on it every morning before breakfast, reporting progress to whoever was in the kitchen with the seriousness of someone filing official dispatches. "The beans are coming," she announced one Tuesday. "3 of them, maybe 4. "4 is good," Evelyn said, not looking up from the stove. "Ethan said 4 isn't enough to matter. Tell Ethan 4 is how it starts." Lucy went back outside to relay this. Evelyn heard Ethan's response, which was inaudible but had the cadence of reluctant concession. The cabin had found a rhythm by then. Not a smooth one, not the kind you'd describe to someone as settled, but a functional one. The kind built from repetition and small adjustments and the gradual understanding of how the people around you move through the world. Gideon came in from the workshop at a more predictable hour now. Not always earlier, but more predictably, which was its own kind of signal. He had started leaving his account books on the table instead of putting them away when she sat nearby, which meant he didn't mind her presence the way he once might have minded it, and which she registered without commenting on. She had picked up a third source of mending work by June, the schoolteacher, Miss Pryor, who was young and overworked and whose wardrobe was taking the kind of punishment that comes from teaching 30 children in a one-room building. She paid less than Mrs. Dabrowski, but was more grateful, which was its own currency. Evelyn's income was modest, but it was hers, and the $31 had become $38, which was not wealth, but was movement in the right direction. The town had not resolved its feelings about her. She had learned to map it, who was curious without malice, who was hostile without confrontation, who genuinely didn't care and just got on with things. Mrs. Holt at the dry goods store. Old Tom Becker, who ran the livery and had sent the letter that led to the Cheyenne job offer, and still nodded to her on the street with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done a decent thing and doesn't need acknowledgement for it. A handful of others. The Alcott faction remained concerned. Foss at the general store had developed the habit of asking pointed questions about her plans framed as friendly conversation, which she had developed the habit of answering with vague pleasantness that gave him nothing useful. She had been in Red Creek for 2 months when Gideon told her about the ranch. Not deliberately. It came out sideways the way things do when someone has been not saying something for long enough that it starts coming out in pieces without their full cooperation. He had a surveyor's map pinned to the workshop wall. She had noticed it weeks earlier, a section of land about 12 miles north, marked and measured, some handwritten notes in the margins in his careful print. She had not asked about it because it was not her business, and she had enough other things to attend to. But on a warm June evening, when he had come in from town with something unresolved in his face, and she had made coffee, and they were sitting at the table in the particular quiet that had become their version of conversation, he said, "The Harmon parcel is coming up for sale in the fall." She waited. 12 miles north, he said. Good land, water access. Enough grazing for a real cattle operation if you built it right. He turned the coffee mug in his hands. "I've been putting money by for 3 years. "The map on your workshop wall," she said. He looked up, a small acknowledgement that she'd seen it and he'd known she had. 560 acres. The price is set. I'm about $60 short of what I need for the deposit, but by September." He stopped. She understood suddenly why the account books were tight in a way that went beyond ordinary. He hadn't just been managing a carpenter's margins. He had been managing a carpenter's margins while setting aside a percentage of everything for 3 years towards something he wanted more than anything else, and had not told anyone about except possibly himself. "That's what you want," she said. It wasn't a question. "Been what I want since I was Ethan's age," he said. "My father ranched. His father ranched. I went into carpentry because it pays steadier and I had children to feed, but—" He paused. "It's what I want. Yes." The fire in the main room made its sounds. Lucy and Ethan were in bed. The night pressed against the windows with the soft insistence of Wyoming's summer dark, which wasn't entirely dark until late, and sometimes felt like the sky was simply considering it. "You'll have it by September," she said. He looked at her. "You're good at what you do," she said. "You have 3 orders pending that I can see from the books, and the hotel job paid well. You'll make up $60 by September if you don't have any large unexpected costs." "Things come up?" he said. "Yes," she agreed, "but you'll get there." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You looked at my books. You leave them on the table." "I didn't ask you to." "No," she said. "I know, I'm sorry. It's habit. My father kept books, And I was always the one who could see where the numbers went wrong. She met his eyes. I'm not trying to be in your business. I saw them. He looked at her steadily, the careful eyes, the face that was honest, if honesty could be a quality of a face. What did you see? He said. You're charging too little for finish work, she said. Your joinery rate is below what Foss told me the man in Laramie charges, and your quality is better. You're also not billing for travel time on the jobs outside town. That's your money you're leaving on the table. A silence. Who told you what the man in Laramie charges? He said. Mrs. Holt. She knows everything that moves through this territory. Something in his expression, not quite the almost laugh of the previous month, but in the same neighborhood. He looked down at his coffee. You've been asking around. I've been listening, she said. It's different. Is it? Mostly. He shook his head, slowly. Not in disagreement, more the way you shake your head at something you hadn't expected to have to reckon with. I'll think about the rates, he said. Okay, she said, and the travel time. Okay. He looked at the map on the workshop wall, visible through the open door. September, he said quietly, to himself as much as to her. September, she said. They sat with that for a while, the shared possibility of it, the word sitting between them like something real. It was the next week that everything changed. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, a big animal, well kept, moving fast down the track from town at a pace that was slightly too aggressive for a social call. She was in the garden when it came into the clearing, and she straightened up and shaded her eyes and looked. She recognized him before she could fully process that she was recognizing him. The recognition was physical first, a tightening across her chest, a stillness in her hands, and then cognitive, clicking into place like something she'd been hoping wouldn't need to be true. Calvin Mercer had put on weight since the train platform. Not much, but enough that she noticed it. He was still well dressed, better dressed than most men in Red Creek, which was a deliberate fact about him, a man who used clothing as a statement about his position. He had a thick dark beard and eyes that were a light clear brown that would have been attractive if they weren't currently doing the thing they did, which was look at everything as if calculating its value. He pulled up at the edge of the garden and looked down at her from the horse. Miss Hart, he said, like they were old acquaintances, like the train platform in April was a pleasantry they'd both be happy to recall. She had been 22 days in Red Creek before she stopped flinching at public moments that echoed that morning. She had been 47 days in before she stopped replaying it involuntarily before sleep. She had not counted the days after that, because she had decided that counting them was giving him more space in her life than he deserved. She looked at him now with the specific feeling of someone who has processed a humiliation far enough that what's left is not pain, but something colder and more durable. Mr. Mercer, she said. Her voice was her own, even, unhurried. You're looking well, he said. He had the tone of a man who has rehearsed an opening and is pleased with it. She did not respond to this. He looked around the clearing, the cabin, the workshop, the garden, the neatness of the woodpile, the general signs of a functioning household. Something moved in his face that she catalogued without reacting to. Assessment, calculation, something that might have been surprise at what he found. I heard you'd set up out here, he said. Wanted to come by and speak with you directly. About what? She said. Not a question, a statement that required him to answer. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. From the garden, she couldn't read it, but she recognized the format. Legal paper, the kind that wants to look authoritative. The marriage contract, he said. Between yourself and myself, drawn up in Caldwell, signed by both parties, witnessed and dated. She looked at the paper. I signed a contract with a man named Douglas Carlyle, she said. You are not Douglas Carlyle. The slight tightening around his eyes. He hadn't expected that to be her first move. The contract was brokered through me, he said. Carlyle was acting on my behalf. The agreement was between your family representative and my interests. Legally, I have no family representative, she said. I signed that contract myself, on my own behalf. My mother was dead, and my father was dead, and there was no one else. She kept her voice even. Who exactly did you make an agreement with? A pause. The legal structures of the arrangement was drawn up by whom, she said. Witnessed by whom? Because I was told I was corresponding with Douglas Carlyle, a widowed landowner in Red Creek, Wyoming territory. I was not informed of any third-party interests. Mercer's jaw worked slightly. He was recalibrating. She could see it. The slight adjustment of a man whose rehearsed approach has encountered a complication he didn't anticipate, namely that the woman he'd dismissed as desperate and compliant had spent 2 months becoming someone who had time to think. There are legal remedies, he said. You came here under a contract. You failed to fulfill its terms. There are costs associated with that. Travel arrangements made, arrangements in Caldwell that fell through. I didn't fail to fulfill anything, she said. I arrived on the appointed date. I was publicly refused. Whatever arrangements fell through because of that refusal are between you and Douglas Carlyle. Miss Hart. His voice dropped into something that wanted to be reasonable, patient, the voice of a man explaining something to someone who is being unnecessarily difficult. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because there's a situation that could be resolved simply if you'd be willing to... To what? She said. He looked at her, the clear brown eyes doing their calculation. To come back to Caldwell with me, where this was all originally arranged, where things could be put right. The word right sat in the air between them. She looked at Calvin Mercer on his well-kept horse with his legal paper and his careful voice, and she thought about the train platform in April, about standing there with $43 and a suitcase while people she would never see again whispered poor pathetic thing, and she thought about the garden behind her with its 4 beans and more coming, and the green book of remedies on the shelf inside, and Ethan's face when he got the arithmetic problem right, and Lucy's uneven braids, and Gideon crouched at the garden's edge saying, I'm getting there, with the voice of a man holding something carefully. No, she said. Mercer's expression shifted, the reasonable patience dropping away, something harder coming through underneath. You should think carefully, he said. The legal position? You should go, she said. And if you come back here with that paper again, I'll ask Mr. Brooks to be present for the conversation. And I'll ask Mrs. Holt, and I'll ask Tom Becker, and we'll have a proper look at what legal position you actually have. She turned back to the garden. She heard him sit on the horse for a long moment. Then the sound of the animal moving and hoofbeats on the track back toward town, receding. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the soil and held them there until they stopped. She didn't tell Gideon that night. She told herself it was because there was nothing to tell yet. One visit, one conversation, no action taken. She told herself it would resolve itself, that Mercer had found the reception he found and would recalculate and decide the trouble wasn't worth the cost. She told herself this for 3 days. On the 4th day, Mrs. Holt flagged her down on the main street. You should know, Mrs. Holt said without preamble, because that was how she operated. Calvin Mercer has been in town since Monday. He's staying at the Mercer house. Yes, he owns part of it. I know, the name is not a coincidence. He's been talking to Foss and to Alcott and to anyone else who'll listen about the legal situation regarding your arrival. Evelyn stopped walking. What is he saying? That you came here under a contract that was never properly dissolved. That your current living arrangements are an attempt to avoid that obligation. Mrs. Holt's eyes were steady and direct. He's framing it as a moral issue, which is a clever angle because it gives the Alcott women something to do. Evelyn breathed through this. He's building a case, Mrs. Holt said. Not a legal one. I don't think he has a real legal one, or he'd have gone to the sheriff already. But a community one, the kind where people's opinions become pressure. Pressure on whom? Mrs. Holt looked at her. On you, on Gideon. A pause. He came into the store yesterday and asked me how long I thought Mr. Brooks would tolerate a scandal attached to his household. I told him it was none of his business, but that was the question he was asking. Evelyn stood on the main street of Red Creek in the June morning and felt the familiar shape of it, the crowd, the judgment, the weight of being the person at the center of a story that other people are telling. She had been there before, she knew its geography, but she was not the same person who had stood on the platform in April. Thank you, she said to Mrs. Holt. Truly. Go talk to him, Mrs. Holt said. She didn't say who him was. She didn't need to. Evelyn walked back to the cabin. Gideon was in the workshop when she arrived. She stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him work. The particular attention he brought to the wood under his hands, The way he moved with a precision that looked like confidence but was actually something more careful than confidence, something earned rather than assumed. "There's something I should have told you 4 days ago," she said. He looked up. She told him about Mercer's visit. All of it. The horse, the contract, the conversation, the no, the shaking hands she hadn't mentioned. She told it factually and in order, and she didn't make herself look better in the telling than she had been. Gideon listened with his hand still on the wood. His face went through several things. The first was a sharpness she hadn't seen before, quick and brief, the expression of someone who has been surprised by news they don't like. The second was a stillness that settled over it, the kind that isn't calm exactly, but is control, a man deciding how to carry something before he picks it up. "He came to the cabin," he said. "Yes." "While I was in town?" "Yes." He set down the plane he'd been using, set it down very carefully on the bench. "And you sent him away," he said. "I did." "By yourself?" "It was my situation to handle," she said. "He came about me, not about you." Gideon looked at her, something in the gray-green eyes that was working itself out. "It's also my house," he said. Quiet, not aggressive, just a fact being stated. "I know. I should have told you that evening. I thought it would resolve itself." "Did you?" "I was wrong." The workshop was quiet except for the sounds of wood and wind, and from the cabin, Lucy's voice telling Ethan something about the beans that Ethan was apparently insufficiently interested in. "He's staying in town," Gideon said, "at the Mercer house. He has a stake in it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mercer, as in the hotel?" "Yes. I built the shelving in their storage room last month." He said it with the flat tone of a man reconfiguring a piece of information. "I know. Mrs. Holt told me." He picked up the plane again, set it back down. It was the most agitated she had ever seen him, and it was contained entirely within those two gestures. "What does he want?" he said. Actually want. She had thought about this in the 4 days she hadn't told him. "I think he came here with one thing and found another," she said carefully. "He came expecting to find someone desperate enough to go back with him because she had nothing else. He found someone who had something." She paused. "That's changed his calculation. I don't know yet in which direction." Gideon looked at her steadily. "He's not going to stop," she said. "Not because of me refusing him on the doorstep. He has too much pride for that, and too much of something else. I'm not sure what. But he came here for a reason that has more to do with himself than with me, and that kind of reason doesn't go away when it's inconvenient." "What kind of reason is that?" "The kind where someone can't stand to have lost something," she said, "even if they didn't particularly want it in the first place." Gideon looked at the map on the wall, the surveyor's marks on the Harmon parcel. Then he looked back at her. "You should have told me 4 days ago," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I should have." He was quiet for a long moment. "All right," he said. Not dismissal. The words of a man who has received information he is now going to think about without drama, and then decide what to do. She went back to the cabin. She started supper. Lucy appeared at her elbow and reported that the beans were definitely 4, possibly 5. Ethan came in from the woodpile and washed his hands without being asked, which was progress that she noted and did not remark on. The supper came together the way suppers do when you know the kitchen and the kitchen knows you back. Gideon came in and washed up and sat at the table, and they ate together, the 4 of them, in the particular rhythm of an evening meal that has happened enough times to have its own texture. Lucy talked. Ethan listened with visible interest and invisible acknowledgement. Gideon ate and watched the table more than usual, some interior calculation running behind his eyes. After the children were in bed, he said, "I'm going into town tomorrow, to the sheriff." She looked up from her mending. "To ask what the actual legal standing of that contract is," he said. "Because Mercer is going to use people's uncertainty about it as a lever, and I'd like to know what the real situation is before that goes any further." "I can go with you," she said. "You can," he agreed. "Or I can go first and come back and tell you what I find." He paused. "Might be easier without both of us in it at once." She thought about this. "All right." He nodded. She returned to her mending. The hem she was working on was complicated. A fine dress belonging to the schoolteacher Miss Pryor the kind of fabric that requires a light touch, or it puckers. She made herself focus on it, the needle finding its path, the thread following. "Evelyn," Gideon said. She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression that appeared when he had something to say that he was choosing words for carefully. "I'm sorry he came here," he said, "while I wasn't home." She understood he was not apologizing for something he had done. He was apologizing for a situation he hadn't been present to prevent, which was different, and which was, in its way, the most Gideon Brooks thing he had said to her yet. "You couldn't have known," she said. "No," he said, "but I'm still sorry." She held his eyes for a moment. The fire spoke, the pines outside carried on their nightly conversation with the wind. "Thank you," she said, and meant it completely. He went to bed. She finished the hem on the schoolteacher's dress. Then she sat for a while in the quiet of the main room after the fire had settled to coals, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the breathing of it, the particular collection of small noises that a house makes when the people inside it are sleeping. The green book of remedies on the shelf, her 3 books beside it, the garden outside, growing at its own pace, the account books with the numbers she wasn't supposed to have looked at, but had, and the rate she'd told him to raise, which he had in fact raised the following week without mentioning it. She thought about Calvin Mercer in the hotel that bore his name, sitting with his legal paper and his wounded pride and his calculation about what she could still be made to do. She thought about the train platform, and the suitcase, and the $43. She thought about Gideon crouching at the garden's edge. She thought about September, and the Harmon parcel, and 560 acres of land with water access, and what it would look like in the early morning when the light came across it. She was not afraid of Calvin Mercer. She had been, briefly, in the garden when the hoofbeats first came into the clearing, the old fear, the reflex of someone who has been humiliated publicly and knows how fast a crowd can turn. But the fear had passed through her and left, the way fear does when you've survived the thing you were afraid of often enough to know you're going to get through it again. What she felt now was something quieter and more complicated than fear. A kind of readiness. The same readiness you feel when you've been watching weather coming from a distance long enough to have prepared. And now the sky is doing what you knew it was going to do, and all that preparation is about to matter. Red Creek was a small town. Small towns have memories and opinions and the habit of community judgment that can be useful or punishing depending on which side of it you find yourself on. She had been on both sides in the space of 2 months. Calvin Mercer was coming at her with a legal paper and a social campaign, and the specific confidence of a man who has never lost anything he decided to pursue. But she was not the woman on the platform anymore. She had fixed the porch step and the stuck window and the swollen door frame. She had built the garden from dead ground. She had raised a boy's confidence in arithmetic and found a lost book for a grieving child and coaxed a man's almost laugh out of 3 months of careful walls. She had made $38 from nothing and learned the street map of this town and the character of its people and who to trust and who to watch. She was not, she thought, going to be easy to move. The coals in the fireplace gave their last light and went to gray. She went to bed. Outside, the Wyoming night did what it always did, enormous, indifferent, and entirely above the small particular concerns of the people sleeping in the cabin at its edge. The storm was coming. She could feel it in the specific way you feel things after you've been paying attention long enough. But she had been through worse weather than Calvin Mercer, and she had learned, finally, the most important thing about storms in this country. You don't outrun them. You build something solid enough to stand in them. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a man of 53 who had the particular economy of movement that comes from decades of dealing with situations that escalate when you move too fast. He listened to Gideon with his hands flat on his desk and his eyes steady, and when Gideon finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "The contract," Pruitt said. "Whatever he has," Gideon said. "Did she sign it?" "She signed a contract with a man named Douglas Carlyle. Carlyle publicly refused her on arrival. Whatever Mercer claims his involvement was, she was not informed of it, and the contract was never executed." Pruitt looked at the window. The main street of Red Creek moved past it in the ordinary business of a June morning. "Mercer's got money, and he's got connections in Caldwell," he said. "That's not nothing. A territorial judge who owes him a favor could make things complicated even with a weak case." "How weak is the case?" Pruitt turned back to him, Weak enough that I wouldn't lose sleep over it if I were you. Strong enough that he could drag it out if he wanted to. Make noise. Cost you time and reputation. He paused. The question is what he actually wants. Men like Mercer don't ride 3 days from Caldwell over a marriage contract they have no real attachment to. Gideon had been thinking about this since the night before. Since Evelyn's words sitting across from him, the kind where someone can't stand to have lost something, even if they didn't particularly want it in the first place. He had turned that over in the dark for a long time. He wants to be seen winning, Gideon said. He humiliated her on that platform. She didn't fold. She built something. He can't stand the accounting on that. Pruitt looked at him for a moment. That's probably right, he said, which means there's no legal resolution that fully satisfies him. You win in court, he finds another angle. He's not here for the law. He's here for the result. Then what stops him? Pruitt was quiet. Pruitt. Something that costs him more than he's willing to pay, the sheriff said. Public embarrassment, maybe, or something that removes his leverage entirely. He looked at Gideon. What leverage does he have? Gideon stood up from the chair. I'll think about that, he said. He walked back from the sheriff's office in the June morning and thought about leverage. Mercer's leverage was the contract. Real or not, it gave him a document to waive, and documents intimidate people who don't know enough to challenge them. His leverage was also the town's uncertainty about Evelyn, the undefined nature of her presence in his household that the Alcott women had been nurturing for 2 months like a carefully tended suspicion. And his leverage was money, the implication that he could make legal trouble expensive and prolonged even if he ultimately lost. 3 forms of leverage. Gideon walked and counted them and thought about what removed each one. The contract needed a clear legal statement of its invalidity, which Pruitt had been careful not to quite provide but had clearly implied. A formal challenge would likely succeed. But formal challenges take time and invite the kind of public examination of Evelyn's situation that she had already endured too much of. The town's uncertainty. This one had a simpler resolution, one that had been present for weeks and that he had been approaching with the slowness of a man who understands the weight of what he's approaching and doesn't want to move until he's certain of his footing. The money. This one was the problem. Mercer had more of it than Gideon, and legal trouble is expensive regardless of outcome. He was almost back to the north track when he stopped walking. He stood in the middle of the road and thought about the surveyor's map on his workshop wall. The Harmon parcel. 560 acres. The deposit he needed by September. The money he had spent 3 years accumulating with the specific patience of a man who has wanted something for so long that the wanting has become load-bearing, structural, the thing the rest of his planning was built around. He thought about what Mercer actually needed to go away. The question was not whether he had enough money to fight Mercer legally. The question was whether there was a way to remove the entire foundation of Mercer's position in one movement. Something that settled the contract question, removed the legal threat, and did it publicly enough that there was no angle left to work. He thought about that for a long moment, standing in the road. Then he turned and walked to the bank. He did not tell Evelyn what he was planning. He told himself this was because he needed to think it through completely before saying it out loud, which was true. He told himself it was also because she would argue against it, which was also true, and he didn't want the argument to talk him out of something he had already decided was right. Whether it was the wise decision was a separate question that he was choosing, at this moment, not to examine too carefully. Thomas Aldridge ran the Red Creek Savings and Loan from a building that was slightly more substantial than everything around it, the way banks always are. A reminder that the money inside has opinions about architecture. He was a precise man who kept his accounts in columns so neat they looked printed, and he had been Gideon's banker since Gideon arrived in Red Creek 12 years ago, which meant he had watched the deposit account for the Harmon parcel grow from nothing to its current number with the regularity of the tides. Gideon sat across from him and told him what he needed. Aldridge looked at the number on the paper between them. Then he looked at Gideon. "All of it," he said. "All of it. That's your deposit for the Harmon parcel." "I know what it is." "Gideon." Aldridge set the paper down. He was not a man who used first names carelessly. The use of it now meant something. "That's 3 years of putting aside. You were 4 months from having the full deposit together. The parcel." "I know. If you withdraw now, the parcel will go to whoever makes the deposit in September. You'd have to start over. 3 more years minimum, assuming the land is even still available. I know, Gideon said. A third time. Quiet. Decided. Aldridge looked at him for a long moment. The precise man with the precise columns trying to find the logic in a decision that didn't have the shape of logic from the outside. Is this about the woman? He said. Gideon didn't answer that. I need the withdrawal today, he said. It's your money, Aldridge said finally. The tone of a man who disagrees and will record his disagreement in his own private accounting and then do what he's being asked because it is, in fact, the man's money. He opened his ledger. I'll need 20 minutes. I'll be outside, Gideon said. He waited on the bench outside the bank in the June morning and watched Red Creek go about its business. Foss opening the general store. 2 women from the Alcott Circle crossing the street with their heads together. Old Tom Becker leading a horse out of the livery with the unhurried authority of a man who has done this particular thing 10,000 times and sees no reason to rush the 10,000 and first. He thought about his father's land in Nebraska, the way it smelled after rain, the specific quality of morning on open grazing land, the light coming across it flat and wide, the particular freedom of a sight line that goes all the way to the horizon without interruption. He had been holding that image for 20 years. He had been building toward it for 3. He thought about Evelyn in the garden with her hands in the soil, saying "we" before she caught herself and corrected it. He thought about Ethan's face the evening Evelyn found his mother's green book, the thing in it that Ethan had taken quickly to his room to be alone with. He thought about Lucy asking every morning about the beans. He thought about the letter from Cheyenne that had sat face down on the table for 7 days and then disappeared into Evelyn's coat pocket, and then eventually simply stopped being mentioned, which was the quietest and most decisive thing he had witnessed in recent memory. Aldridge came out with an envelope. Gideon stood and took it and put it in his coat. I think you're making a mistake, Aldridge said. You might be right, Gideon said, but it's mine to make. He walked to the Mercer house. The hotel was the second largest building in Red Creek, which in this town meant it had 2 stories and curtains in the windows and a dining room that served 3 meals a day to travelers and locals who could afford the prices, which were Mercer prices, and reflected his opinion of his own establishment. Gideon had been inside it professionally twice, the shelving job last month, a window repair the previous year, and he knew its layout well enough to find the front desk without looking like he was finding the front desk. The clerk told him that Mr. Mercer was in the dining room. He was. Sitting at the center table, not the best window table, not the corner table, but the center, where you can see the room and be seen by it, with a cup of coffee and the expression of a man who has decided to be seen, being unhurried and comfortable and in his correct position. When Gideon walked in, Mercer looked up and something moved in the clear brown eyes. Not alarm. More the expression of a chess player who sees the board change unexpectedly. Brooks, he said. Pleasant. Controlled. A man who has been expecting a version of this moment and has prepared for it. Gideon sat down across from him without being invited. I'm going to speak directly, Gideon said. Please, Mercer said, with the tone of someone extending generosity. You have a contract that you believe gives you some claim on Evelyn Hart. Whatever the actual legal weight of it is, and he saw the slight flicker in Mercer's face at the implication that it had been assessed. You intend to use it as leverage, community pressure, implication of scandal, the suggestion of legal action without the actual commitment to legal action, because the actual commitment would require a judge to look at what you actually have. Mercer said nothing. He was listening with the stillness of someone who has decided to let the other person define the terms first. I'm not going to fight you in court, Gideon said, not because I think you'd win. Because the fight itself is the point for you. It gives you something to do in this town, gives people something to look at, makes her position uncertain for as long as it runs. He put the envelope on the table. This is your compensation. Mercer looked at the envelope. Count it, Gideon said. Mercer picked it up and looked inside. He counted it. Gideon watched him do it and watched the calculation run behind the clear brown eyes. The number, what it meant, what it cost, what it bought. This is significant, Mercer said, carefully. Yes, Gideon said. It's everything I had set aside for the deposit on a land purchase. It took me 3 years to accumulate it. He said it simply, not for effect, but because the fact of it was relevant. I'm giving it to you because it removes every legal excuse you have. It's fair compensation for any legitimate costs associated with the original contract. It's more than fair, and it is absolutely the last money you will ever see from me or from anyone connected to me." Mercer looked at him. The calculation continued. "This doesn't change what She is not part of this transaction," Gideon said. His voice stayed even. He had decided before he came in that the voice would stay even. "You never had a claim on her. A contract brokered without her knowledge of your involvement for a marriage she was told was with someone else does not create ownership. She is not property. She never was." "I'm not suggesting—" "Yes, you are," Gideon said. "That's exactly what you've been suggesting since you rode into town. The paper gives you something to waive. It gives you the language of rights and claims and legal remedies. But what you're describing is a woman who should do what you want because you have a piece of paper, and that is—" He stopped himself, chose the next words. "That's not how this works." The dining room was not full, but it was not empty either. A couple at the window table. The clerk, who had found reasons to stay near the doorway. A man at the counter with his back turned, but in the precise posture of someone listening intently. Mercer was aware of this. Gideon was aware that he was aware. "You're making a scene," Mercer said, quiet. "I'm having a direct conversation," Gideon said. "If it's uncomfortable to have it where people can hear, that's information about the conversation." A silence. Mercer looked at the envelope again. The money inside it that Gideon had spent 3 years saving and 30 minutes deciding to give away. Something moved through Mercer's face that was more complicated than Gideon had expected. Not just calculation, but something underneath the calculation. Something that might have been, in a different man, shame. "You're doing this for her," Mercer said. "Yes," Gideon said. "You've known her 2 months." "About that." Mercer looked at him with something that was trying to be contempt and not quite managing it. "And you're giving up your land purchase?" "Yes." "That's—" Mercer stopped. "Probably not the smartest financial decision I've ever made," Gideon said. "I'm aware." The man at the counter had turned around. The couple at the window had given up pretending to look out the window. The clerk in the doorway was making no effort at all. Mercer sat with the envelope and the fact of what had just happened and the audience that had witnessed it, and Gideon watched him understand the position he was now in, the money in his hand, which was a resolution, and the room around him, which had seen a man give up 3 years of savings on behalf of a woman Calvin Mercer had left on a train platform, and the specific arithmetic of public opinion that was now doing something Mercer had not planned for. He had come to Red Creek to be seen winning. The room was not watching someone win. Mercer put the envelope in his coat. His face had gone to a careful neutral that cost him something to maintain. "We're settled then," he said. "We're settled," Gideon said. He stood. He looked at Calvin Mercer one more time, at the well-dressed man with the clear brown eyes and the legal paper and the pride that had carried him 3 days' ride to reclaim something he'd thrown away. And he said quietly, so that only Mercer heard it, "You left her on a platform with nowhere to go, in front of a crowd. She didn't fall apart. She didn't beg. She picked up her suitcase and she walked." He paused. "I thought you should know what you walked away from." He left the dining room. The main street met him with its ordinary June business, the sunlight on the uneven planks, the distant sound of the livery, a wagon going slowly toward the north road. He stood on the boardwalk outside the Mercer house and breathed the outside air and felt the specific weight of a decision that cannot be undecided. The Harmon parcel. September. 560 acres of land with water access that would now belong to someone else. He stood with that. Across the street, he noticed that 3 people who had been on the boardwalk when he entered the hotel were still there, in the approximate positions of people who had not moved because they were waiting to see how something came out. Tom Becker was one of them. Mrs. Holt was another. The third was a young man he recognized as one of Foss's counter clerks, who would make sure the story was in 12 kitchens by evening. Tom Becker met his eyes and nodded once, the nod of a man who has seen something he respects and is recording it. Gideon nodded back and walked toward the north road. He was most of the way home before he heard the horse behind him, faster than a casual pace, gaining on him with purpose. He turned. It was Evelyn. She was on the borrowed mare he kept for practical use, writing with the directness of someone who learned on a working farm and doesn't have time for ceremony about it. She pulled up beside him and looked down at him, and her face was doing several things at once. The complexity of someone who has received news secondhand and is sorting through what it means and what she is allowed to feel about it. "Mrs. Holt sent her boy to the cabin," she said. "I thought she might. She told me what you did." A pause. "Gideon." "It's done," he said. Not dismissive, just factual. She got down from the horse. She was not graceful about it. Her skirt caught, and she had to yank it free, and the landing was practical rather than elegant. And then she was standing in front of him on the north road in the June afternoon, with the pine forest on both sides and the sky enormous above them. "The ranch deposit," she said. "Yes." 3 years. "Yes." "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. There was something rough in the words, not anger, but the texture of someone who has been a burden before and has spent years learning not to be one. "No," he said, "you didn't." "Then why?" "Because he needed a reason to go," Gideon said. "And the only reason that actually works with a man like that is a reason that costs him something. Taking the legal argument away removes the thing he was using to stay." He paused. "And because it was the right thing to do and I could do it, so I did." She looked at him. Her eyes were dry but working at it. "You gave up your land," she said. "I'll get other land," he said. He said it with the specific tone of someone who is not certain of this and knows it and is saying it anyway because the alternative framing is not useful. She was quiet for a moment. The pine trees moved above them in the light wind. "I'll pay you back," she said. "It'll take time, but I'll pay back every dollar." "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do." The words came out with a firmness that left no room for argument. "You don't get to do something like that and then tell me I don't have to account for it. That's not how this works. I will pay you back." He looked at her, the firmness in her face, the same quality he had first seen on the train platform when she'd said, "I see," to Douglas Carlyle, and turned and walked away. The quality that was not hardness, but was something harder to come by than hardness, which was dignity that has been tested and held. "All right," he said. "When you can." "When I can," she said. They stood on the road. The horses moved slightly, and the forest held its position, and the sky continued its indifference. There was something between them that had been building for weeks in the way of the garden, incrementally, from apparently unpromising ground, at its own pace and not available for hurrying. "I need to tell you something," Gideon said. She waited. He looked at the road ahead and then at her and decided, as he always decided with the things that mattered, to say it directly rather than dress it up. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "I've been thinking about how to say that for a while in a way that isn't unfair to you, given your situation, given that you came here for something else and it didn't turn out. But I think not saying it is also unfair in its own way. So," he stopped. "I don't want you to leave. The children don't want you to leave. Though Ethan would rather eat the woodpile than say it, and He paused. "I've been coming home earlier. I don't think I was aware of it for a while. Then I was aware of it and pretended I wasn't." He looked at her steadily. "I'm aware of it." She was very still. "I know I'm not the situation you planned," he said. "I know there are parts of this that are complicated and parts of me that are," he chose the word carefully, "not easy. I know I close up in places and I leave things unsaid past the point where they should have been said. My wife used to tell me that I could have a whole conversation in my head and then be genuinely confused why the other person didn't know how it ended." Something moved in Evelyn's face. "She sounds like she knew you well," she said. Quiet. Not a threat to the moment. A fact offered honestly. "She did," he said, "and He stopped again. The stopping was not uncertainty. It was the same precision he used on the joints of wood, the care for the thing fitting together correctly. "I am not trying to replace that. I would not ask you to step into a shape someone else left. I'm saying that what I feel when you're in the room is different from what I feel when you're not in the room, and what I feel when you're in the room is considerably better, and I am 43 days away from September, and I have just given away my land deposit, and I would like—" He stopped a third time. "What?" she said. "I would like to know if what I'm telling you means anything to you," he said, "or if it's just something I needed to say." The June afternoon held very still. Evelyn looked at him, at the careful face, the gray-green eyes, The man who had stepped forward on a train platform 2 months ago to ask a practical question on behalf of a stranger, who had shown her a room with a sticky latch and fixed the latch without being asked, who had handed her coffee without ceremony at 5 in the morning and said these are good about her biscuits with the specific sincerity of someone who is not comfortable with compliments and gives them only when they're unavoidably true. It means something, she said. He let out a breath. Small, barely perceptible. The breath of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time. Okay, he said. I'm not ready to name all of it yet, she said. I want to say that honestly. I don't move quickly with things like this. I've had one plan fall apart already, and I'm still finding my footing, and I don't want to... She stopped. I don't want to say more than I know yet. That's fair, he said. Immediately. Without any sign of disappointment that she could read, which she thought was either very controlled or very genuine, and she was increasingly certain it was the latter. But it means something, she said again, making sure he had it. It means something, he repeated. They stood another moment, then she looked at the road. We should get back, she said. Lucy will have opinions about what's in the garden and no one to tell them to. She'll tell Ethan, he said. Ethan does not receive them with appropriate enthusiasm. No, he agreed. He doesn't. She gathered the mare's reins. He walked beside her on the north road, through the pines, through the afternoon light that was going golden the way Wyoming afternoons do in June, extravagant with it, pouring it over everything without discrimination. The cabin appeared through the trees at the clearing's edge, the garden behind it, its rows visible from the track. The woodpile Ethan had been working on, neater than it had been, the specific neatness of a boy learning to take pride in a thing. The porch with its fixed third step, the window with its fixed latch. Lucy appeared at the door before they had fully reached it, with the timing of a child who has been watching the track for arrivals. There are 5 beans, she announced. I told you there were 5. You told me possibly 5, Evelyn said. I knew it was 5, Lucy said, with the authority of someone revising the record. Ethan appeared behind her in the doorway, assessed the situation, and said, Did something happen in town? He said it to his father, but he was looking at Evelyn. Some things got settled, Gideon said. Ethan looked at him for a moment, then back at Evelyn, reading both of them with the particular acuity of 11-year-olds who have learned to watch adults for information that adults think they're not providing. Good, he said, and went back inside. Lucy had already moved on to the beans and was providing a detailed update that did not require responses. Evelyn stood on the porch, the fixed porch, the third step solid underfoot, and looked at the clearing, the pines at its edges, the sky above them going toward evening. The afternoon was cooling. Somewhere further north, she thought, 12 miles up a road she hadn't traveled yet, there was 560 acres of land with water access that would go to someone else in September. She thought about that. She thought about what Gideon had said on the road, and what she had said back, and the specific shape of the thing that had been named without being fully named yet, like a room you've been standing in the doorway of and have finally, 1 foot at a time, begun to enter. Lucy was still talking. The garden had 5 beans. Inside, the fire in the main room was still carrying its warmth from the morning's build, the cabin holding it the way a good-built thing holds what it's meant to hold. She went inside to start supper. Calvin Mercer left Red Creek on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the dining room conversation that the town had been quietly discussing ever since. He left early, before the main street was fully awake, which was its own kind of answer about the conversation he did not want to have with anyone on his way out. Tom Becker saw him go. Tom Becker saw most things that moved through the livery at dawn, and by mid-morning the information had reached Mrs. Holt, and by noon it had reached the cabin on the north edge of town through Lucy, who had heard it from the baker's daughter at her Tuesday lesson, and delivered it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting established fact. The man on the horse is gone, she said, at the kitchen table, helping Evelyn pit dried cherries for a cake that had no occasion except that cherries were available and it seemed like the right week for a cake. I know, Evelyn said. Ethan said good riddance. Ethan's not wrong. Lucy considered this, turning a cherry in her fingers. Were you scared of him? Evelyn thought about the honest answer. A little, she said. The first time he came. But not the second time. There wasn't a second time. Because Papa went, Lucy said, with the simple logic of a 7-year-old who has assembled the sequence of events and reached her conclusion. Yes, Evelyn said, because your Papa went. Lucy seemed satisfied with this. She went back to the cherries with the focused commitment of someone who has been given an important task and intends to do it correctly. Evelyn watched her for a moment. The dark braids, even now, properly done, the gray-green eyes trained on her work, and felt something she had been feeling more frequently in the past weeks and still hadn't found the exact right word for. It was in the neighborhood of belonging. It was also something more careful than that, more earned, because belonging you haven't earned is just proximity, and she knew the difference. The summer settled in around them in the particular way of Wyoming summers, which are brilliant and brief and seem to know it. The garden produced beyond the 5 beans. It produced with the specific enthusiasm of soil that has been properly turned and fed after years of neglect, as though it had been waiting for someone to pay it appropriate attention. Tomatoes, more beans. The greens she had planted in the first cool weeks that came in fast and had to be eaten before they bolted in the heat. Gideon said, one evening in July, looking at the dinner she had built almost entirely from what was growing 20 feet from the back door, that he had not eaten this well since his wife was alive. He said it simply, not as a comparison that diminished either woman, but as a fact about quality and care. She received it the same way. She had continued paying him back, $10 in June from the accumulated mending work, 8 more in July when the Mercer House laundry contract came through properly, a sum that was modest against the total, but was real and regular, and she kept a careful account of it in a small notebook she had bought from Foss's store. Gideon had stopped saying she didn't have to. He had understood, somewhere in the first repayment, that accepting it was the more respectful thing. What had changed between them after the North Road conversation was difficult to describe in simple terms, because it was not a simple change. Nothing had been declared, no formal terms renegotiated, but the distance that had been in the room with them, the careful management of proximity, the particular vigilance of 2 people who are aware of each other's presence in a way that requires active handling, that had eased. They sat closer at the table in the evenings. He told her things about his day without waiting for her to ask. She told him about the mending work, the conversations with Mrs. Holt, the small intelligence gathering about the town that she had become quietly good at, and he listened with the full attention of someone who considers what you are saying worth considering. Once he reached across the table to show her something in his account books, a calculation he was working through, and his hand was near hers for a moment, not touching, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them mentioned it, and the evening continued. Small things. Accumulating. It was Ethan who finally broke the arrangement open, in the way that children sometimes do, not because they intend to, but because they are less willing than adults to sustain a fiction indefinitely when the truth is sitting right there. It was a Sunday in August. Evelyn had been in the cabin for just over 3 months. The summer was beginning to show its first hints of retreat, the evenings coming darker a little sooner, the mornings carrying a new quality of cool that was not yet autumn but was thinking about it. Gideon had gone to look at a job across town, a fence repair that a neighboring property owner had been after him to assess. Lucy was napping, which she still did on Sundays and would deny if asked. Ethan was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a problem that was not school-related. She could tell by the way he was approaching it, with more frustration and more investment than schoolwork produced in him. She sat down across from him with her mending and worked in silence for a while, which was the correct approach. Ethan opened like a door that swings inward. If you pushed, it closed. If you waited, it eventually moved on its own. After 10 minutes, he said, "If someone wanted to give something to somebody, how do they know what to give?" She looked up. He was staring at his paper. "Depends on the person," she said. "What do they like? What do they need? What would they not get for themselves?" He chewed on this. "What if you don't know them that well yet?" "Yet," she said. He glanced up, caught. He looked back at his paper. "There's a girl at the lessons," he said, in the tone of someone providing information they are not emotionally attached to. "Clara Becker, Tom Becker's granddaughter." "I know Clara," Evelyn said. "She seems sharp. She's very smart," he said, with the careful delivery of someone who has practiced that sentence for casualness and not quite achieved it. "She doesn't know she probably doesn't notice." Evelyn returned to her mending. She notices, she said. He looked up sharply. How do you know? Because I've seen how she watches you when you're doing your figures, she said. She checks her answers against yours. She doesn't do that with anyone else. Ethan was very still. For the gift, Evelyn said, not looking up from her work. Something she can use, something that shows you paid attention to what she cares about. Not something expensive, something considered. Those land differently. He was quiet for a long time, then. She draws maps. She draws them in the margins of her lesson papers. Not real maps, just invented places. Then find her a proper blank journal, Evelyn said. One with good paper for the maps. He looked at his own paper. That's good, he said, in the tone of someone surprised by the quality of the advice. I had some practice being 11, she said. He almost smiled. She saw the corner of it and looked back at her mending before he could notice her noticing. They sat in the Sunday kitchen with the summer afternoon moving past the windows, and after another while, Ethan said, in a voice that was careful in a completely different way from his usual careful, I'm glad you stayed. I didn't think I would be, but I am. The needle in her hand went still. She looked at him. He was looking at his paper. His jaw was set in the way of someone who has said a vulnerable thing and is now waiting to see what happens to it. Thank you, she said. That means more than you know. He nodded once, got up, took his paper to his room. The door closed quietly. She sat in the kitchen for a moment with the mending in her hands and the empty room and what had just happened filling it. Gideon came home 40 minutes later to find her at the stove, and both children occupied and the cabin smelling of the cake that had been that morning's project, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the scene with the expression he had, the one she had come to know, the one that appeared when he walked in and found the household better than he'd left it, and felt something about that he didn't have ready language for. How was the fence assessment? She asked. Straightforward repair, he said. 2 days' work if the weather holds. He hung his hat, washed his hands. How was here? Good, she said. Ethan wants to go to Foss's store tomorrow. I told him I'd take him. Gideon looked toward the hallway where Ethan's room was, something questioning in his face. He wants to buy a gift, she said, for a girl at his lessons. A long pause. Clara Becker? Gideon said. She looked at him. You knew? I've been watching him get distracted during lessons for 6 weeks, he said. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I left it alone. He figured it out himself, she said. Gideon shook his head slowly, with the specific expression of a father encountering the evidence that his children are growing into people with their own interior lives that proceed without his knowledge or supervision. They do that, she said. Apparently, he said. He sat down at the table. She brought him coffee, the way she had been bringing him coffee since the first morning, which felt now like something they had always done, which was strange to think about because 4 months ago they had never met. He wrapped both hands around the mug. I went by the land office today, he said, after the fence job. She waited. The Harmon parcel hasn't had a deposit filed yet, he said. The owner decided to extend the window. Health issues, some delay in the estate arrangements. He looked at his coffee. The new deadline is January. She set down her own mug. January. If nothing goes wrong between now and then. He stopped, started again. I've been looking at the numbers. The hotel contract you brought in. The rates I raised on the finish work. There's a chance, if the fall orders hold, that I could... He paused. It's not certain, but it's possible. She looked at him steadily. It's possible, she said. With 2 incomes, he said. If we were... He stopped again. The same precision, the same care for the joints fitting correctly. I've been thinking about what I said on the road, what you said back. So have I, she said. And she looked at her hands around the coffee mug, at the small scar on her left forearm from the scythe when she was 16, at the calluses that had been there since she was old enough to work and had never entirely gone away, at the hands of a woman who had been practical her entire life and had spent 4 months learning that practical and emotional are not opposites, that sometimes the most practical thing and the thing your heart is asking for are exactly the same thing, and you have been treating them as separate problems when they were always one. I'm done being a guest here, she said. I decided that a while ago. I just wasn't sure what the alternative was called. He looked up from his coffee. I know what it's called now, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. From Lucy's room, the particular silence of a child who is theoretically napping and may or may not be asleep. From Ethan's room, the soft sound of a pencil on paper, drawing or writing or working out something that required private space. I'm not easy, Gideon said. He said it as a warning and a fact simultaneously. I've been told, she told me, that I make people feel like they have to earn things I should just give freely, that I close doors without knowing I've closed them. I know, she said. I've been on the other side of some of those doors. And you're still here. And I'm still here, she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, I'd like to do this properly. If that's something you want, a real proposal, not a practical arrangement, not a temporary situation with an undefined future. He looked at her directly. I want to marry you, because I want to, not because the town thinks I should, not because it solves a problem, because you fixed the porch step before I asked, and you found the green book, and you told my son what to give the girl he likes, and you stayed when you had somewhere else to go. He paused. And because the room feels different when you're in it. I said that before. I'm saying it again because it's still true. She looked at him. The honest face. The careful man who had walked into a bank and withdrawn 3 years of savings because it was the right thing to do, and he could do it. Who had said, I'm getting there in a garden at the end of May, and had, in fact, gotten there. Yes, she said. He let out a breath. She had heard that breath once before, on the North Road, and she knew it now for what it was. The sound of a man releasing something he has been holding for a long time. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. From Lucy's room came a sound that was very specifically the sound of a child who was absolutely not asleep and had heard something and was struggling enormously with the requirement to remain quiet about it. The struggle lasted approximately 4 seconds. Are you getting married? Lucy appeared in the hallway at a volume that addressed the entire cabin and possibly the nearest 3 pine trees. Lucy, Gideon said. Because if you are, I want a new dress. We can discuss the dress, Evelyn said. I want it to have buttons. It can have buttons. Lucy processed this. Then she turned and went back down the hallway. A moment later, Ethan's door opened. She's being loud, he said, appearing in the kitchen doorway. Yes, Gideon said. Ethan looked at his father, then at Evelyn, then back at his father. The calculation in his face that was his most consistent feature, but warmer now, the eyes less guarded, the assessment less adversarial than it had been in April when he had stood in this same doorway and said, why is she here with the flat hostility of a boy who had already lost enough and was not willing to lose more? Good, he said. For the second time in an afternoon, with the same economy of a person who says what they mean and nothing extra. He went back to his room, the door closed. Gideon looked at Evelyn across the kitchen table. They've known longer than we have, she said. Probably, he said. The wedding was 3 weeks later, on a Saturday in early September, at the Alcott house, because Margaret Alcott had reversed her position entirely once the situation became official and had, in the particular fashion of community women who transfer their energy wholesale from one position to another, become its most enthusiastic organizational force. Evelyn allowed this because Margaret meant well, and because fighting it would have cost more than the result was worth, and because she had come to understand that Red Creek's investments in its own community stories, even the ones that had been tiresome when aimed at her, came from the same root as its capacity for loyalty and care, and you could not cleanly separate them. Mrs. Holt stood through the ceremony with the composed expression of a woman whose private predictions have been confirmed and who is too dignified to say so. Tom Becker sat in the back row and nodded occasionally at nothing in particular, the nod of a man at peace with how things turned out. Lucy wore a dress with buttons. She counted them twice during the ceremony and reported to Ethan afterward that there were 11, which she considered excellent. Ethan stood beside his father at the front of the room and was present in the full sense of the word. Not performed presence, not the careful presence of someone maintaining their position, but the real kind, the kind that shows up when a person has genuinely decided something. When Evelyn stood beside Gideon and they said the words that made the thing official, she was aware of how little this moment resembled the one she had planned in Ohio, the one she had built a 2,000-mile journey around. The man was different. The circumstances were entirely different. She was different in the ways that 3 years of difficulty and 4 months of finding her footing in a place that wasn't supposed to be her place had made her different. She thought briefly of the train platform, the suitcase, the $43, the poor, pathetic things she had heard and had chosen not to become. Then Gideon was looking at her the way he looked at her, direct, steady, without performance. And the platform was a long time ago. The September deadline for the Harmon parcel passed 11 days after the wedding, with Gideon's deposit filed 2 days prior. The numbers having held from the summer's work and 2 incomes and the specific arithmetic of a household that had learned to be efficient without being joyless. The full purchase was 2 years out yet, but the land was theirs in the essential sense, claimed, committed to, waiting. 12 miles north, 560 acres sat with its water access and its grazing land, and its mornings that she had not seen yet, but was beginning to imagine. She had a habit now of asking Gideon to describe it, the specific topography, where the creek ran, which direction the sunrise hit it first. He described it with the careful precision he brought to things he loved, and she listened and built the image from his words, and it became something shared before either of them had stood on it together. That was how things worked, she had learned. You built them together before they were real, and then you went and made them real, and the building was never wasted even when the reality came out different than the image. The cabin was warm through September. The garden went to its autumn state. The last tomatoes, the beans finished, the soil ready to be put to bed for winter. She turned it the way she had turned it in the spring, alone then and not alone now, Ethan working beside her without being asked while Lucy provided supervisory commentary from the porch steps. One evening in October, with the fire built up against the first real cold of the season, and the children in bed, and the account books on the table between them showing numbers that were tight but manageable, Gideon said, "I keep thinking about what I said to Mercer. In the hotel." She looked up from her mending. "That you knew what you were worth," he said. "That's what I meant to tell him. That's what I should have said instead of what I did say." She was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" she asked. She had been told the version Tom Becker had reconstructed from the witness in the counter, which was detailed but possibly not complete. "That he should know what he walked away from," Gideon said. "Which is true, but it's not—" He paused. It made it about him. What he lost. "I was thinking about you, but the words came out about him." She looked at him. The fire spoke quietly. Outside, the October wind was starting the long conversation with the pines that would last until spring. "It doesn't matter what you said to him," she said. "What mattered was that you went." "Still," he said. He looked at the table. "You should hear it straight. You knew what you were worth. Even on the platform in April, you knew. You didn't believe him when he told you a different story about yourself. And that's—" He stopped. The careful word choosing. "That's not a small thing. Most people believe the worst version eventually. You didn't." She sat with that. She sat. It wasn't entirely true. She had believed it, in the dark of the storage room on the first night, looking at her mother's photograph with $43 and nowhere to go. She had believed it, and she had sat with it, and she had gotten up before dawn and made biscuits because doing something was the only way she knew to argue back against the part of her that wanted to agree with what Calvin Mercer and Douglas Carlyle and the whispering woman on the platform had implied about her value. But she understood what Gideon was giving her in the saying of it, and she was not going to pick it apart. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, returned to his books. The fire continued. The wind and the pines carried on their seasonal argument. Somewhere in the cabin, in the room that had been a storage room and still had a window with a latch that required a specific combination, lift, twist, but that no one needed to demonstrate anymore because everyone who mattered knew how it worked. Somewhere in that room, there was still a worn suitcase at the back of the closet. She had thought, at some point over the summer, about unpacking it completely, about putting the contents into drawers and onto shelves and releasing the suitcase to whatever secondary use an empty suitcase could be put to. She had decided to leave it, not because she was planning to leave. She was not planning to leave. She had made her decision about that on a north road in June with the pine trees on both sides and the specific weight of a man's honesty asking her to answer honestly back, and she did not revisit that decision. She left the suitcase because it was true, because it was the object that had carried her 2,000 miles to a platform where everything fell apart, and then sat under a rope bed in a cold storage room while she figured out what to build from the pieces, and was still there as a record of the whole sequence. Not a warning, not a wound, but a fact. The fact of where she had been and what she had come through. She thought her mother would have understood that. The woman in the photograph from 1871 who had also spent her life rebuilding. Who had also made peace with circumstances that weren't the plan. Some lessons you receive from the living, and some you receive from what the living left behind. And either way, you carry them forward into the life you're actually living, which is never the life you fully planned, but is the one you have. And what you do with it is the only question that ever really matters. Red Creek was not what she had imagined when she read the advertisement in the back of a regional gazette in Denton Falls, Ohio, with her cousin Margaret's handwriting in the margin. Evelyn, what about this? It was something she couldn't have imagined, which was not the same as something less. The fire burned. Gideon closed his account books with the sound of a man satisfied by the numbers, or at least at peace with them, and looked across the table at her. She looked back. Outside, the frontier night stretched itself over the territory the way it always had. Enormous, cold, indifferent to specific human arrangements and the specific human feelings that accompanied them. And inside the cabin at the north edge of Red Creek, the warmth held. It had been built carefully, from imperfect materials, by people who were themselves imperfect and had stopped pretending otherwise. That was enough. In the end, it was more than enough.